Good morning, or good afternoon, or who cares? Today I'm going to give you our top 5 fictional characters, starting from the least favourite to the most favourite. Keep watching. At number 5, and it was honestly difficult to know who to relegate to the number 5 position because all of these characters in their own right are pretty important to me as I've grown, as I've watched movies, as I've developed my tastes and interests. But number 5, we're going to put her Ellen Ripley. Now, Ellen Ripley was in the old 1970s sci-fi horror movie Alien. In that movie, it's set aboard a spaceship, the Nostromo, out lost in space somewhere, on its way home from a mining expedition. They get a distress call and they answer it. Turns out it's from an alien spacecraft containing an alien egg which infects the crew. The crew are normal people, and that's what really sells the movie. These are ordinary working people who just happen to work in space in the future. The alien creature infects them, takes over, and eventually kills everybody. And no one really knows what's going on. There's a lot of conspiracy involved in the story. The story's great, the movie is fantastic, but Ellen Ripley is the standout character, and she stands out because she's the most sensible. She's got basically common sense. She comes out as a classic female action hero. She starts off as just an ordinary person. She's not the captain of the ship. She's not the one we expect to survive at all. But because she keeps her head and because she uses a little bit of common sense and intelligence, she's the only one that survives the first movie. In the second movie, she becomes a totally different character. Haunted by what she's seen, she's asked to go back and try and help with discovering if there are any other people that have been injured by these aliens. Now, during that film, we really see her develop as a female hero, and it was brilliantly done. I mean, it wasn't done like the modern style of feminist action movies where they're high-kicking and punching, and you see these gigantic stuntmen just tumbling over if they breathe near them. This was done in a much more sensible and mature way. It uses her basic femininity as her ultimate strength. When she gets back to Earth, she's been asleep for decades in using scientific technology from the future. And her daughter's dead. Her daughter's grown old and died, and she's not seen her grow up. This obviously tears at her heart, and when she goes back to the colony, she more or less adopts a small child, and they have this mother-daughter relationship, and in the end, the little girl does scream out, "Mum," and she hugs her. And it uses that femininity to drive the story and to drive the character to do things that otherwise she wouldn't have been able to do. And it builds on who she really is as a person. So she's a fantastic character. She survives by thinking, by being intelligent, by outsmarting, and by being a woman. She's a strong female character whose strength comes from the fact that she is a woman. We couldn't replace her with a man. We couldn't replace her with anything else. She has to be Ellen Ripley. And that's how we know she's a well-written character that I respect. She's a fantastically written character. She's the kind of person that I would like to have a beer with. Great character, brilliantly written.
Did IQs just drop sharply while I was away?
At number 4, another female character that I respect is Sarah Connor. Now, she started life in the 1980s movie Terminator. Now, in that film, she begins out as an ordinary woman, just living an ordinary life. She's a waitress, and not a very good one. We see her in her daily life having ice cream poured down her clothes by a child. We see her hate her life. She's barely getting by. She has no aspirations to be an actress, even though she lives in LA. She's just an ordinary person, just struggling to survive with her friends. Going to see movies on Saturday night, her date lets her down, she's just living the worst possible life. And then this whole situation kicks off and she discovers that her future and her future son is going to be much more important than she ever dreamed, and this means that she can't carry on living with her head buried in the sand. She's got to now rise to the challenge. And over the first 2 movies, we're going to ignore the other movies, over the first 2 movies we see her go from this ordinary woman into becoming this heroine who literally creates her son and gives him all the power he needs to change the future. So she, even though he's the hero in it, she is the one that does everything to turn him into the person he needs to be. She's basically the hero and the protagonist of the story, whichever way you slice it. Now she was another brilliantly written character that I respect. Because of what happens to her in the movie, we always have to deal with the fact that she could just be completely insane. They keep mentioning that she is insane. Everyone calls her insane. Robots from the future are coming back. She's the only one that can see them, the only one that believes it. So everyone accuses her of being completely crazy. She's the only one that doesn't think she is. And we see her change. In the first movie, she goes from being basically an overgrown child into being a self-realized, self-actuated woman who's in charge. She's got a military protector, and she ends up taking control of the situation and being in charge. So she tells him what to do. By the end of the movie, she's taken control, and she's now the boss. In the second movie, we see her entire body change. She's lost all of her fat, she's developed muscle, she's now a soldier herself. She's turned herself into a completely different person who's a soldier. You know, she uses guns proficiently, she teaches other people how to be a warrior. And it's impressive to see a character develop in such a realistic way. She's motivated by her fear of the future. We still see her scared. She's not the kind of feminine superhero where nothing bothers her at all. She's not in control, she's terrified, but she's risen to the challenge and she's facing it head on. So we see her as a human being. She's dealing with something utterly awful, you know, the end of humanity, and she's rising up to cope with it as the best she can. So I've got to respect her as a character. She's well written, she's believable, she's well rounded, and I love the way that she develops over the course of the first two movies. By the third movie, they've killed her because I don't think they could afford to hire her. The fourth and fifth movie, we won't even talk about, they're utter crap. And she does return in Terminator Genesis as, I can only describe as a modern feminist, with a voice that sounds like she survives on ultra-strong cigarettes and whiskey, and she just isn't the same character anymore. She's just this horrible caricature that looks like, you know, she was buried in the third film and someone's dug her up again. It's just awful. So let's let the version of her from the second movie rest in peace. Great character. At number 3, probably a character you've never heard of from a movie and from a comic book you, again, have probably never heard of. It's called Watchmen by one of my favourite writers, Alan Moore. Now, all he ever wrote was comic books, and a lot of people look down on comic books and graphic novels, but I saw him develop from the early stages where he wrote D.R. and Quinch, which was just a science fiction comedy, which was really clever, really intelligent, really smart, and it really got me into him as a writer. He was writing originally in 2001 AD, which was a comic book magazine released in England, that's where Judge Dredd started, and a lot of other characters that they weren't quite as successful. But it was a clever, intelligent sci-fi magazine, and it was a better story. It was a really smart story. It was a couple of evil aliens from the future come back in time and sort of modify the Earth as a prank, and they end up creating the human race just as a prank to upset their teacher. And it was a brilliant story, very clever, well written, and it got me into him as an author. Now he went on to develop Watchmen, and Watchmen was an absolutely brilliant story. It took the idea of comic book superheroes and it took it to a logical extreme. It's set in an alternate world where we developed Mr. Manhattan, and that was an experimental accident where we create a superhero who loses his humanity. But we also have these costumed adventurers. Now these are just people like Batman, who just dress up in costumes and try and solve crimes and help people, but they're just really not to be taken seriously. And in the book, they're illegal. They've had to quit long time ago, which is where we get the idea, who watches the Watchmen? Now it's a great story, and it's multi-layered as a comic book. It has human drama. We learn all about the history of these characters, and we learn about a huge conspiracy to destroy the world, just as World War III is looming. And it's a brilliant story. And Rorschach is easily the best, most interesting character in it.
I can't help him.
He starts out as as a beaten up old middle-aged man who's lost control of his life, and it's driven him completely insane. As the story develops, we find out more about his history, his personality. His mother was an awful person, used to beat him, and he ended up with this warped sense of justice. So now he just travels around at night wearing this long coat and a mask covering his face, and he just kills people. He kills people because they commit crime, and you can't be soft on crime because it'll just happen again and again and again if you do. So instead of punishing and arresting people and giving them to the police like Batman or Superman, he just murders them in cold blood and leaves their bodies there. And even though they're illegal, he won't quit, he won't give up, he just keeps fighting and fighting. And that's the sort of cornerstone of his philosophy, that you can never quit. You should never back down. You've got to stay firm on crime, otherwise it will take over. And even as World War III is looming, he never backs down. Now this was turned into a Schneider movie, which was brilliantly done, except they changed the ending, and that sucks because I was a huge fan of the original ending. But the movie was actually really well done, and the casting of Rorschach was superb. He was brought to the screen brilliantly. It was almost like watching the comic book come alive.
Hey, Rorschach. Hey, you're pretty famous, right? Hey, you know what? I'm pretty famous too. Ain't that right? That's right. That's right. You know, maybe I can give you an autograph, huh? What you say, big boy?
None of you seem to understand. I'm not locked in here with you. That's it! You're locked in here with me!
Great character, well worth watching the movie, especially if you haven't read the comic book, because you'll probably enjoy it. If you have read the comic book, you might be disappointed, but it's well worth a look. He's a brilliant character, and he sort of takes the comic book characters to the extreme, and he makes you think, well, what would happen if these people were real? Because dressing up in these weird costumes and going out at night to solve crimes, that's not something normal people do. So what would they really be like if this was to really happen? And it does make you think. So he's a great character, and he's my number 3. Number 2. So while we're doing number 2?
Number 2.
Number 2. While we're talking about number 2, I think it's just worth pointing out that he's playing a game where he's basically an animated corpse of a small child haunting a dog that's had its head sawed off. I'm not joking. I don't know what this game is, but it's. I've got he's got an Amazon Kindle. It's locked down for 4 to 6-year-old, and he's playing the ghost of a small child, and he's just sawed the head off a dog. Now he's floated up some stairs, and he's haunting a bedroom. What a crazy world we live in. Which brings me nicely to my number 2. Now, my number 2 character is Dave Brown. Now, he's a character that I wrote. He's one of my own characters, and he's probably my favourite character. I have actually written another character that I think I prefer, but there's no point talking about him because you'd need a lot of reference, and it's too difficult. But Dave is an awesome character. Now, he's based on several people I knew. He was based on an Indian guy I used to work with who had this idea that he was incredibly funny and incredibly attractive to women. Neither of those things were true. But he laboured under this false idea that everybody loved him, and no one did. It's also based on a friend of mine, Aid, who's one of my oldest friends who's still back in England, and he's just utterly insane. He makes no sense. He comes out with, you can tell that he's just very, very strange. He's warped. The things that come out of his head just don't make sense. He thinks differently to other people, and not necessarily in a good way. I like people who are different, but he just can't quite get it together. And I like that about him. He's fun to watch. He's very, very difficult to deal with. And so I took those elements and qualities and saw what happens. I brought some of myself to it, and the story is Rob and Dave. So Rob is a smart guy who thinks he's smart, but actually he's kind of dumb. And Dave thinks he's dumb, but is actually very smart. And it's a sci-fi set in the far future where the world has changed and people are just all stupid and crazy. And Dave is the stupidest and craziest of them all. And he just does crazy things. He doesn't care what anybody thinks of him. He's utterly insane, and he's just given up. And now all he does to amuse himself, because everyone's stupid, he amuses himself by just being a horrible person to people. And just does crazy things. And the stories just write themselves. I mean, Rob is a fat ginger guy who's his foil. He's the one that he abuses most, although he abuses everybody. And he's just hilarious to write. I loved creating him. He was based on friends of mine, so the stories kind of just rolled out. And he became easily my favourite character. At one point, I gave a couple of chapters to a girl I used to work with, and she loved it. She started calling me Dave and teacher Michael Rob, because he was vaguely ginger. And I think he just killed another dog. Yeah, so he's a fantastic character, a lot of fun to write, just a lot of fun. It's a lot of fun to sort of take the idea of someone doing something that's utterly insane to the furthest degree you can possibly go, and just have total fun with it, because you're living in a future, so it doesn't matter what you do. Everything's changed. Everyone accepts that who reads it. So Dave, I can do whatever I want with him. So it's fantastic fun to write. So he's my second favourite character. And at number 1, James, who is a huge fan of nonsense, even he knows the greatest character of all time. Who is the greatest character of all time? Piss. The number 1 greatest fictional character of all time is... Batman. On the surface, Batman is a pretty dumb character. He started out life as a man in spandex back in the 50s, fighting crime while wearing his underwear on the outside of his trousers. But as he's evolved, he's become a lot more than that. He represents the best of humanity and the best of masculinity. He's a man who never quits. He's a man that never gives up. It's a man who's been through the absolute worst and has come out a better man, a tortured man, but a better man for it.
Wait. You could die. At least tell me your name.
It's not who I am underneath, but what I do that defines me.
Bruce?
He's still killing dogs. Batman, I grew up with Batman. I grew up with the comic books. I grew up as a child with the Saturday morning cartoons. We used to get a lot of Batman cartoons. There was a live action TV show from the 60s that was rerun, because I'm not from the 60s, I'm from the 70s. That used to run on TV, and I loved that. The Adam West Batman, it was just utter nonsense, but it was of its time, and it really struck a chord with the kids of my generation. We loved it. It was camp, it was nonsense, it was silly, but that's what kids like. Then in the late 80s, Batman was reinvented. They hadn't really read the comic books, so they didn't know what the comic books were meant to be. They didn't know who Batman really was, so they just tried to reinvent the TV series in a darker, more gothic way. They gave it a more black look. And they created this dark version of Batman that we still kind of know today. So the movies have evolved separately from the comic books, and I don't think in a good way. I don't think there's been one good movie adaptation that does Batman actual justice. I think the Christian Bale Batman was pretty good. The first 2 movies were good, but Batman gave up. By the end of the second movie, Batman just gives up, and he would never do that. That's the cornerstone of who he is as a character. He would never back down, he would never quit. He just fights because he has to fight. So I didn't like what they did with him as a character. And then in the end of the third movie, he just retires. And again, Batman would never do that. He would just keep going until he physically can't go further. I think the Ben Affleck Batman in the more recent films did a pretty good job. It showed an older, wiser Batman. I think it went a little too far with his physicality. And it kind of lost some of the realism, and it forgot that Batman doesn't have any special abilities, which is what makes him such a compelling character. He is just a man in a suit who's trained himself and worked very hard to earn everything he's got. And that's one of the things people really like about and appreciate about him, that he's something a bit special that we could all do if we really wanted to. And I think that the Ben Affleck movies took that away from him by making him so much larger than life in an unrealistic way. But I think they got closest to the comic book version. The earlier ones never really got close. They tried to turn him into a comedic parody, and it just failed. That's not Batman. In the comic books, he's a very together man. He's a very sensible man, very clever man. They focus on writing him as a very intelligent man who realizes that the only way to do this is to dress up in a silly costume. He understands that he's got to be anonymous. He can't just work for the police. He's got to go further. He's got to be something that people can identify with. He's got to be an idea, an ideal, a symbol. And the bat is the perfect symbol for this dark city he lives in. And it takes that he's not insane, that he's living in an insane world, and he's playing along with it. The costume is armoured because he wants to survive, and he just fights on. There's a comic book panel where he comes home, his dog is barking at him, he just pulls a knife out the side of his arm, says, "I'm fine," and just carries on working, because he's covered in scars and another cut to his arm is not that big a deal. And it just writes him as a character that just won't quit, believes in what he's doing, and is driven and motivated by helping other people. That's a very different version to what we see in the movies. I don't know if the Batman movie is ever going to come out. They're making that currently, but they're trying to write him as a young man who's cobbled together a suit out of bits and pieces. They want to write him as being completely insane. I don't see that is who Batman is as a character. We'll see what they come up with, but I think they don't do him service. I think Batman is at his best when he's the best version of us, when he's someone that we could be if we had to go through the terrible things that happened to him. We would be capable of rising to the challenge and being a good man, even after being beaten to the ground by seeing our parents murdered in front of us, instead of our children murdered in front of us. That would be awful too. Hot? Hot? Yeah. We'll drink some water then.